Hello and welcome back to the AI Ethics Now podcast. My name is Dr. Tom Ritchie, and I'm pleased today to be joined by Smera Jayadeva, a researcher in responsible research and innovation from the Alan Turing Institute.
Hi, Tom. Great to be on this conversation with you.
Thanks, Samira. So, do you mind giving us a little bit more about your role and some of your interest in the topic of AI, please?
Yes, of course. So I'm a researcher, as you've mentioned, in responsible research and innovation. This falls under the ethics theme of the public policy program at the Alan Turing Institute. A lot of our work ranges from different domain specific research, such as healthcare, to audience specific, such as children's rights. And some of our work also goes beyond that to cover the general ethics of AI and AI based systems in public policy and what governments can do to better implement equitable policies surrounding the use of technology.
Fantastic. It sounds fascinating, and I think exactly what we're hoping for our students to learn more about. Let's get on with the first question then. How can AI be used to address global challenges like climate change and poverty?
I think there is a lot of scope for technology in general and AI in specific to influence some of these domains, particularly climate change and poverty. Easiest way to describe it is, let's just take climate change, for instance. We have existing Turing research called IceNet that works with the British Antarctic Survey to investigate sea ice change, and they model the data to see how the movement of sea ice can impact the general climate, as well as see what those impacts are for indigenous communities living in these regions. So, using this example, we can see how through extensive amounts of data that we're building up over nearly decades now, we can model better policies for the future. We can also see how we can use the data to map out what might happen when it comes to the climate, something that we using meteorological institutes across the country and across the world. They have been collecting a lot of this data, and we can see how there is a use to all of this data and all this hard work and research that they've put into this. And at the same time, we can see with climate, there's an important question about agriculture as well. There is another Turing based research system that was building a digital twin, and this was also to investigate interventions. So, if you take a digital twin of a potential plot of land and you use that to investigate whether certain pesticides or water based systems or irrigation systems can influence the growth of that crop, you can probably better intervene without actually harming the crop. You're just intervening on the digital scale. So, we have the modeling, we have the data, we have a digital twin, and you can now see how there are these different very wide ranging applications when it comes to climate change. On the other hand, we have poverty, where you could argue that there is the scope for better policy interventions, and some countries do believe that having better data can do this. But I think poverty is a social issue that requires a lot more a social understanding and a social policy on inequity in society to better cope with the issue. But at the same time, we also know, using that social analysis, that poverty can arise from certain areas because of certain social backgrounds of individuals and communities. So if we can use AI in maybe education or AI in sectoral interventions like agriculture, as I just mentioned, maybe that can be a way to bring some of these communities out of poverty.
I know your background's in policy briefs and policy writing. If you could maybe speak a little bit more about how AI is used in some elements of writing policy around these areas, please.
It is interesting. I will flag first, though, that when we first started investigating the use of foundation models or the large language models for government use within government circulars and how they could be used in policy briefs and whatnot, there was a lot of uncertainty because a lot of the material shared between government agencies is rather confidential and sometimes requires a deeper understanding of the specific domain that you're working with. So, if we have a certain department X working with the Department of I don't know, health and social care, for instance, they might require very specific understandings of it. So a general model might not have that nuanced understanding. So I would flag that there are certain issues such as that, the security, the confidentiality, and the domain knowledge that could pose challenges for the use of it in policy briefs and writing. But at the same time, I also see the use of maybe an AI system in identifying general grammar and sentence correction, something that you would require a couple of hours to copy edit a document. I myself know that I would be grateful to use something like this to see where I use passive voice wrong. It's a mistake that everyone makes. So you can see how there are these roles as well. For the public sector to make these better decisions, they need to be skilled with the tools necessary to understand what a form of technology is, understand fairness issues, and so forth. Some One of the most important projects I'm working on right now is the AI Ethics and Governance in Practice program, which is a series of 8 workbooks that were developed to give everyone an understanding of what AI systems are, what fairness looks like, how that sustainable the stakeholder engagement method that I mentioned could work in practice, understand questions of explainability, transparency, data management, and finally accountability as well. And these are well structured to look into specific context, which is very important. So each workbook comes with a focus on, say, transport, traffic management, healthcare, surveillance and policing, and so on and so forth. So you can, and this is, as a lot of the work that the Turing does, is completely open access. So for whoever's listening, this is an amazing resource if you want to learn more about this and want to engage with this work further.
I agree with you around knowledge specialism. It doesn't, or subject matter expertise. It doesn't particularly have a lot of that at the moment. But AI for me has been a really useful tool to help with ideating and developing ideas. So asking it for 20 ideas of how to solve X problem, knowing that most of them probably won't make any sense or won't work, but it just gives you those ideas where you can then add in that almost that value that you can bring from your experiences as a human being who's worked in these fields and done other things. Thank you. I think that's really, really useful, particularly in the context of the assignment that they'll be working on. I wanted to ask you as well, what do you see as the potential benefits of using AI in healthcare and education?
Healthcare is a really interesting one, and I would draw everyone's attention to a report that we've written with the Department of Health and Social Care. This research required us to look into whether AI systems can be equitably deployed in the domain of healthcare, which seems like a fairly easy question when we first confronted it. But then we realized there are so many issues with this. And again, it all boiled down to the social problems that we face. Um, and this is where it's interesting because Professor Michael Marmot wrote the health equity in report, and it was, I believe, in 2010, and then he followed that up in 2020 again. And the report is absolutely fascinating because they found out that the issues that we often face with healthcare isn't actually a result of the problems with hospitals or staffing per se, but actually arise from social causes and biases within societies and inequity that exists within society on a more granular level. Using his report and his understanding as our baseline, we then started to see how technology might play a role in this. And what was important as a conclusion from that is that there are these social issues that an AI system or any form of technology cannot just you know burn down. It cannot just evaporate it in a second, just using this one thing. But on the other hand, we also found that there are some really interesting uses of some forms of technology, including AI, in the healthcare space. We can see it being used in hospital administration which could reduce the amount of time that, say, surgeons and doctors and nurses might be using up to instead care for their patients better. We can also see it having potential uses in diagnostics and general diagnostics and radiography, particularly in identifying cancer cells. There have been a lot of studies that have found the use of that certain AI systems have been able to identify cancer cells at in a more efficient manner than some of the humans who are probably in this field, which again shows all of these spaces for potential positive growth in the sector. But I think the most fascinating thing for me personally when it comes to healthcare is the recent developments in AI have made it easier to map out protein structures of DNA. And that means we can create better vaccines and make sure we're safer against any kind of diseases or, pandemic like the one we faced in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I've been speaking about in the content for this week is the role of AI in drug discovery as well, being able to actually help with a lot of that process. I think you're right, and there's a theme that's come through from a few of your answers, which is perhaps sometimes we overthink the role of AI, and we see it as this thing that's a fundamental change in the world, and that may be down to media representation. Whereas actually, from listening to your answers, it feels like it's much more about giving you marginal gains in different areas and taking on some roles of checking data, checking information, rather than currently producing new information, producing perhaps new ways of understanding the world, which I think there is perhaps a slight disconnect between how people understand what AI can currently do versus what I think we're told perhaps it can do or what we believe it can do from looking at, as I say, various kind of media representations and narratives that go with it. I think following on from that, that a lot of media narratives we see related to AI, particularly on places like social media and in newspapers and more traditional media, focus on this idea of superintelligence when it comes to AI and almost AI as a threat to humanity. And I wondered, we speak more about those challenges in a later week, but I wondered if you'd be happy now to perhaps reflect on how we can ensure that AI is developed and used in a way that benefits all of humanity. Because we know there are ethical issues. We know there are challenges with bias, with privacy. We know there's challenges of training data with the global south and energy usage. But I wonder if you wouldn't mind reflecting on, how we can ensure that AI is developed and used in a way that benefits all humanity.
Yes, no, that's a fantastic question, and I think it's something that should be addressed, and and bring as many people as possible into this conversation on the supposed AI hype. I often have find myself engaging with individuals in social situations or in more formal professional settings where there is this concern over AI being the super intelligence that's going to take over humanity, and that's what we need to be concerned about. And these kind of existential threats, which are often hyped by some of the biggest media, by some big icons in on social media, shouldn't be where we're focusing our attention, especially our policy based attention. This only gives a surface level understanding of what the technology is and the rate of its current development, and it's a way of masking the fact that some of these issues are the issues that they're thinking about humanity taking over the world, and that we should be worried about our AI overlords, maybe 20 years from now, is not as much a concern as the importance of thinking about bias, as you'd mentioned before, and the other challenges that we already see with the production of data. With that in mind, how can we have a positive future with AI? This is something that's central to a lot of the work that we do at the Turing. And I believe a huge part of this is captured by the statement, nothing for us without us. And that is so fundamental. That stakeholder engagement element is so fundamental to building any good form of technology, even if it's not a predictive form of technology, because we're using these forms of technology on a very wide variety of people. And often these may be isolated groups working on a certain model. So if you were to build an AI model for to look at how council housing should be allocated in a certain community, this model might be developed by someone who, say, lives in London, and they use a lot of data that might be sourced from different parts of the world just to begin the training of the model. And they might be engaging with certain policy folks in a general county, but not including the county, not including the specific neighborhood where this is going to be deployed. All these different groups will have different social positions, different economic positions, different experiences in life, and many of these individuals might have never interacted with the council housing system at all. So what we often stress on in the work that we do is engaging with the stakeholders, engaging with vulnerable communities to see where how the use of this technology can mediate or affect positively or negatively their livelihoods on a day-to-day basis. So if we are going to use technology, it should be done in a way that ensures that the benefits that we see are not limited to the fewest number of people, but is spread to as many as possible. And if I could give another example, and going back to healthcare, for instance, there there are a lot of AI systems and AI or tech apps that are being released for consumption. when these models are being developed and they have to go to the regulatory authorities, of course, flag it because they believe that it's not performing on certain groups well. What companies then end up doing is just changing the system to say this is only supposed to work for this one subgroup. So then what we end up seeing is the same group that has benefited from technology in one way or the other for decades, if not centuries, continue to gain some form of benefit from it. And here we also see the role of the political economy, how we investing our capital, what are venture capital, and what's private equity investing in, how can we use capital in a way that's meaningful in the kind of economic structures that we live in.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that question perhaps goes beyond AI as a discussion point as well. It's interesting that you're speaking about these more democratized AI spaces because it leads on to my next question quite nicely, which is linked to the issue of governance. And actually, how do we even begin to have the discussion around governance of AI? Who should do it? Where should it happen? When? There's so many questions about how it's done in an equitable way that can allow for as much interaction and stakeholder engagement as you mentioned. So, with that in mind, I wonder if you would be happy to reflect on how individuals, businesses, and governments, from your experience of working at the Turing Institute, can work together to effectively shape the future of AI.
Yes, of course. So, the stakeholder engagement method that I was describing is something that we've written about extensively in some of our research outputs. I'm happy to share those resources with you because they are open access, and it can help you understand that with the resources available, how do you best engage with all of these different communities and map out the strengths and differences between different communities. But I think what's fundamental to even bring all of these individuals together, bring individuals, businesses, regulatory authorities, policymakers, governments, venture capital funds sitting in a different country. If you to bring all of these different people together, I think the most important point is addressing digital literacy or illiteracy. It's not just the capacity to use a phone anymore, but it's understanding what those words mean. Often people talk about black box AI, explainability with AI, technical safety, all of these words. And I can understand why it would be disconcerting, or it might lead to individuals feeling like they don't have a grasp of what this new form of technology is. And that kind of isolation can possibly lead to tensions between different groups who would want to use a form of technology. So that digital literacy is not only necessary for the individuals who might be using it, but also for government and also for businesses who are using it. In the start of the year, I recall a lot of reports being released by firms talking about how AI is going to change the world. We're going to see $1 trillion being invested in this and that. And now, nearly 8 months on, we see them changing their tune and saying that this was, we probably it's probably not as bad as we thought it was. And that often comes because there's this hype that we've spoken about earlier about what this technology is. And that's another element. And with government as well, if we want public services to use forms of technology like this to reduce their burden, to make their lives a bit more efficient, and to give them some more capacity to make better policy decisions, they too need to understand what the different forms of AI and ethics relate to, be it in data, be it in those technical problems, be it in the fairness considerations that we must always keep in mind, and also in accountability and what the governance of that might look like.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to pick up on one of your points about the hype that we saw earlier in the year, it makes me reflect on previous AI winters where things were massively overhyped. It didn't quite reach what people were expecting. And then we saw this kind of retreat from it being this, yeah, massively overhyped thing. I think your point about digital literacy as well, and particularly explainability, are key and will continue to grow because the more complex the AI systems get, the harder it's going to be to explain them and to be able to teach people to understand them and to have that explainability. And it feels like that the black box perhaps around it is growing. And as much as we can try to look in that box, it becomes more and more difficult, particularly when you see these large AI systems. I don't know if it's a chicken and egg situation of you almost need the governance to create the situation where people can understand it to then understand the governance. But it's where do you begin on that process that can be really challenging.
when we take explainability, that's often discussed. You have developers who often see explainability in a very technical sense. So, how do we uncover this black box? What are the technical measures? And it usually involves a series of equations and complicated math in order to understand this. But that can often forget the other side of explainability, which is the explanation of AI systems to the individuals. And this is not only in the digital literacy case, but also explaining to individuals why an AI system was used. So, which can almost work in a way as a self governance method. So, if you are going to use this form of technology, you owe it to the individuals on whom you're using it to give them an explanation as to why you did, what, how the system performed, and as simply as possible. Because this, and that simplicity is really important, because if we see it, we can now see how AI systems are often interacting with children and the next generation, so to speak. And as they grow old, they're going to interact with this more and more and more. But are we able to, in very simple terms, explain what a form of technology is doing to a child? And for instance, a child who's in the social care system, do they know the kind of influences that this kind of technology is having? And what's important here in the UK context is that Scotland's actively working to keep these kind of children's rights in mind. And UNESCO has also developed a framework to ensure, children are part of this discussion on explainability, and to ensure that explainability doesn't just stop at technical measures, but goes beyond that to explain our interactions with that form of data.
And I think it brings us back really nicely to your point about nothing for us without us. That's a really key foundation stone that almost needs to stay in all of these conversations. And I would recommend to the students and others listening that needs to be at the core of your thinking. What you're describing as well sounds what we're trying to do with the module that we're currently teaching on, where we have got the computer scientists in the room who'll understand the equations and have that concept of explainability. But then we have got students from global sustainable development, we have got students from the law school, and trying to bring all of these different groups together to synthesize a kind of new way of understanding AI, but from their own individual disciplines. Thank you so much, Samira. I think it's been a really interesting conversation. It's been great to get some insight into the work of the Alan Turing Institute and also some of the open source resources that people can use. Yeah, thank you so much, and have a lovely rest of the day, and speak to you very soon.
And thank you so much, Tom, for having me on board. I'm happy to take any questions or support anyone who wants to hear more about this.